As the calendar changed from 1974 into 1975, the progressive rock genre was enjoying one of its greatest periods of both commercial and artistic success. Some of the finest bands of the genre, including Pink Floyd, Jethro Tull, Yes, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, were all doing very well both financially and artistically during this period. What the general public didn't realize was that there was quite a bit of upheaval going on behind the scenes in the progressive rock world. Pink Floyd in the early 1975 timeframe was still riding high on the success of its great March 1973 album, The Dark Side of the Moon, which had been on the North American Billboard charts pretty much continuously since its release and would remain there nearly continuously for almost the next 15 years. But there were some things happening behind the scenes in Pink Floyd land that, at least at the time, the public did not realize. First and foremost was that Pink Floyd was looking to take their next steps beyond Dark Side. It had already been, in early 1975, close to 2 years since Dark Side came out, and the public was eagerly awaiting a new album. There were two reasons behind the delay. One was that the band was wanting to finalize the subject matter that they were going to market with. By this time, Pink Floyd had written most of a new album, Animals, which they ultimately set aside temporarily in order to pursue a different piece of subject matter, which became the album that would be released first in November of 1975, Wish You Were Here. The change in direction here caused quite a bit of conflict between Roger Waters and his bandmates, and could be viewed as one of the first altercations that would ultimately lead to the breakup of the band in the early 1980s, although obviously we're still quite a way from that having happened. The other thing that was happening to delay a new album release was that, at least in North America, Pink Floyd were changing record labels. They had, up to this time, been represented worldwide by EMI Records through EMI's Harvest label. However, in North America, Pink Floyd were never particularly satisfied with the promotion that was given to their records by Harvest and its American parent label, Capitol Records. In 1975, Pink Floyd struck a deal to sever that relationship. They remained with EMI Harvest internationally, but were represented strictly in North America by North America's then largest record label, CBS Records, through the CBS Columbia label. So all of these factors were delaying Pink Floyd's follow-up to Dark Side that the public at this time was eagerly awaiting. In early 1975, Jethro Tull were one of the world's leading prog bands as well. Jethro Tull recorded for Chrysalis Records, distributed in North America by Warner Brothers, again, one of the largest labels in the United States. Warner Chrysalis had been very happy with Tull's performance over the last several years, since Tull's breakout success in early 1971 with their fourth album, Aqualung. Tull followed Aqualung up with several successes, including 1972's Thick as a Brick, which was a #1 album in North America, the compilation Living in the Past, which was a top 10 record despite being a double record set, A Passion Play in 1973, again #1, and 1974's War Child, a top 10 release. The issue with Jethro Tull had to do with the perception of the band by the music press, particularly in Great Britain, where the band was being slogged fairly regularly and almost more viciously from album to album, beginning with a passion play, where the music press accused Jethro Tull of resting on its laurels and rehashing old themes with each passing release. This wasn't necessarily true, but it certainly didn't help the band as far as gaining any new fans was concerned. In North America, probably the biggest progressive rock label was Atlantic Records. Atlantic was the home of Yes. Atlantic distributed Yes's albums internationally. Atlantic in North America also distributed Emerson, Lake and Palmer's albums through ELP's Manticore Records label, and King Crimson's records through a licensing deal that Atlantic had with Island Records and EG Records. Atlantic had also recently acquired distribution rights in North America for the famous Charisma label, specifically for purposes of distributing the work of Genesis, who by this time had become stars in Europe, but had not yet broken through in the United States, in part because of being with a record label that was financially somewhat unstable and not able to properly promote their material. Atlantic's acts all went through a bit of upheaval in late 1974 and early 1975. The first of these issues was with King Crimson, who ceased to exist, to quote the press release that Robert Fripp issued in late September of 1974, shortly before King Crimson's album Red would be released. King Crimson was not a major seller in the United States, but they had a great reputation as a live act and were a band that Atlantic knew they could count on for getting a good 150,000 or so sales per album. So this was news that was certainly disquieting to them. On the heels of that announcement, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, upon completing their brain salad surgery tour of 1973 and 1974, decided to go on extended hiatus. They would not return to touring until 1977, and it would be until the spring of 1977 before they released new album material to the public. Yes also decided to take a break from touring in early 1975. They didn't completely take a break from recording, as Emerson, Lake and Palmer effectively did. They instead went ahead with releasing solo albums. But the solo albums were not going to be guaranteed sellers. Atlantic certainly understood this, as well as Yes's management. And indeed, it was the case that none of the Yes solo albums were significant hits in the marketplace. Atlantic was a bit worried, given these developments, as you might expect. In order to help stem the tide and to keep Atlantic progressive rock in the best possible light publicly in 1975, Atlantic went so far as to secure the record contracts of two acts that were fairly successful in the UK and in Europe, but had not yet broken through in the United States, releasing Hawkwind's album Warrior on the Edge of Time and the sensational Alex Harvey Band's live album. Unfortunately for Atlantic, these records didn't take the public by storm in North America either. Warrior on the Edge of Time could only reach number 115 on the Billboard charts. SAHB Live only made number 100. All the more startling in retrospect when one takes a look at the quality of these albums. These are among the best albums these bands made. So there was a bit of worry going across the record industry, not about whether progressive rock would survive, but whether it could continue to thrive at the level it had previously. In the 70s, record companies were always looking for the next big act, and the void that some of this turmoil in the progressive rock space created opened the gates a bit for several new acts to emerge on the prog rock scene. Most of these acts had already signed record company contracts. Some of them, in fact, had made several albums before breaking through in the 1974 through 1976 timeframe, which I'll discuss here today. These acts, while they were classified, at least at the time, as progressive rock acts, tended to be a little bit more simple in their song structure. They favored melody over complexity and didn't necessarily lean as much on classical tradition or on jazz and changing time signatures as some of the earlier prog rock bands did. Ultimately, many of these new bands would be classified using a new term, arena rock. Music that could translate well to the large arenas that popular music acts were now playing in at the time. Back in the days when prog rock first emerged, most of the music was being played in clubs or in small theaters. By 1974, the biggest of the prog rock acts were playing at places like Madison Square Garden in New York, like the Rainbow in London, and in some cases, even at large stadiums. And this new music, in many cases, was often tailored such that it would translate very well into these larger venues. I'm going to talk about 6 bands to go over this trend. 3 of the 6 bands are British. The other 3 are from North America, marking the first significant time that North American bands would play in the progressive rock space. Several of these bands, it's also notable, were a bit younger than their original prog rock counterparts, where the first prog rock musicians were children of the middle and late 1940s and often came from the counterculture. The newer breed of musicians were several years younger. They were likely teenagers growing up with the first wave of progressive rock and translated their love for that music into something that became their own over the course of time. I'll talk about the bands based on geography, and I'll do so chronologically within geography. So with that, the British bands first. The first of these bands on my list is Supertramp. Supertramp's first album was released to the public in 1970 and was not released in North America. Supertramp, at least at its outset, could have been considered something of a vanity project. They were funded by a Dutch millionaire who basically gave Rick Davies and Roger Hodgson their head as far as creating the type of music that they wanted was concerned. They were given money to secure studio time. They were allowed to produce themselves and to hire on the various musicians that they needed in order to bring their music to life. And Supertramp made their first 2 albums this way. A notable point about their first album is that Davies and Hodgson did not create the lyrics for Supertramp's first album. They left that to the guitar player that they brought on board, Richard Palmer James, back in those days known simply as Richard Palmer. That relationship did not continue beyond the first album, however, and Palmer James would go on to other projects, most notably working through his friend John Wetton to become King Crimson's lyricist for approximately 2 years, between 1972 and 1974. Davies and Hodgson's relationship with their benefactor ended following their second album. They were able to retain a record company contract despite the fact that their first 2 albums did not do well, and were able to bring on board the musicians that would form their classic lineup, including John Helliwell on horns, Dougie Thompson on bass, and Bob Siebenberg on drums. And in 1974 created the album that I've always considered to be their best, Crime of the Century, which placed squarely in the middle of the Billboard Top 100. It did not become an immediate hit, but eventually would go platinum as the band continued to make strong records going forward, with perhaps their strongest showings later in the decade of the 1970s with their albums even in the quietest moments, and of course with the multi-platinum Breakfast in America. The next band on my list is the Electric Light Orchestra. Some people, I think, might question why ELO is here, insofar as that the roots of ELO go back to the middle 1960s with Roy Wood's and Bev Bevan's original band, The Move. The Move, although they had multiple hit singles in the UK, unfortunately never crossed over to the United States. They released various singles and albums in North America with first A&M Records and subsequently United Artists Records, but those records did not take off. At the same time, by 1970, Wood and Bevan, by this time now joined by guitarist Jeff Lynne, had decided to start the Electric Light Orchestra project to run as a parallel project to The Move. The famous quote from the band about this was that they wanted ELO to pick up where the Beatles had left off with I Am the Walrus. And in that manner, they created some very strong albums going back as early as 1971. Their first self-titled album is quite a good one. ELO's second album is flat out progressive rock. The shortest song on the album runs 7 minutes, the longest over 11, and the music is very dramatic. It could have been, I suspect, a larger hit in North America, if not for the fact that United Artists made ELO's cover of Chuck Berry's Roll Over Beethoven into a single, and while it charted and did respectively well, it branded ELO in the States at that time as a novelty act, and it was hard for them to get past that. ELO's third album, On the Third Day, did moderately well also, but ultimately it would be in late 1974 with their fourth album, El Dorado, where ELO really took off. The hit single from that album, Can't Get It Out of My Head, literally did stick in your head like an earworm. It was that melodic and that lovely a tune. By this point in time, John Lennon had made statements in the press also that ELO was becoming his favorite band, that ELO had indeed emerged in a manner where he could have seen that if the Beatles had stayed together, that they would have been creating music like that. And towards that end, although I've never seen this 100% confirmed in print, I suspect that ELO's song from El Dorado, Mr. Kingdom, is a direct homage to John Lennon. Listen to the melody and tell me that you don't hear Lennon's Across the Universe in the background as that's being played. The last of the British bands on my list is Queen. Queen's first two albums were very much infused with progressive rock, and that's not an accident. The co-producer of their first album was John Anthony, who had collaborated with Genesis on their early albums Trespass and Nursery Crime. Queen's recording engineer and ultimately producer, the recently departed Roy Thomas Baker, did a masterful job of recording this band, and despite the band's lack of keyboard instruments or synthesizers, did a terrific job of overlaying guitar parts and especially overlaying vocals in order to create some memorable music. Queen 2, released in early 1974, made it to the American Top 100, and unfortunately, other than for Seven Seas of Rye, didn't really break through to radio airplay in a significant way. It would be until later 1974 with their third album, Sheer Heart Attack, and the song Killer Queen, before Queen became a radio fixture. Of course, in 1975, Queen would become a radio fixture forever with the release of their album A Night at the Opera, and of course, their fantastic record, Bohemian Rhapsody, which is probably one of the few 70s-era progressive rock songs that still receives regular airplay on radio today. Going on now to the North American bands, the band Styx from Chicago goes back as far as 1971. Styx would make 4 albums between 1971 and 1974 for the local Chicago Wood and Nickel label, which was affiliated with RCA Records and funded by the music impresario Jerry Weintraub. And they made some very good records during this time, but unfortunately the music didn't really find its way outside of the Chicago regional market until such time as Styx decided that they wanted greater exposure with another record label. They broke their contract with Wood and Nickel and signed on with A&M Records, but not before going to a local Chicago DJ and requesting that one of their songs that had been previously ignored upon its initial release in 1973 get some airplay in regular rotation in order to help them as they got started with their label change at A&M. The song in question, of course, was Lady, originally released in 1973, becoming a monster hit in the spring of 1975. The strength of the single Lady put the album that it was issued on, Styx 2, onto the record charts, making number 20 on the US Billboard chart. And it also helped Styx's first two albums for A&M, Equinox in 1974 and Crystal Ball, featuring their new guitar player Tommy Shaw, to make the charts as well. Styx would take off like a rocket ship with their next release in 1977, The Grand Illusion. One of Styx's biggest competitors in the North American prog rock, arena rock space in this time frame was the band Kansas. Kansas's first album was released in early 1974. At the time it was released, it wasn't taken terribly seriously. Kansas were produced by Don Kirshner and recorded for Kirshner's record label. Don Kirshner was a very, very powerful man in the American record business, but he had also supported the notorious projects by the Monkees, as well as the recordings for the Archies cartoon group, which were very successful financially for Kirshner, but which tainted him as someone who was only in it for the money, for better or for worse. But Kirshner, nevertheless, because of his power in both the recording industry, his Kirshner Records label was distributed by CBS, as well as television. Kirshner's syndicated music program, Don Kirshner's Rock Concert, was a fixture on American television throughout the early and middle 1970s. Kirshner's power with both the recorded and television media gave Kansas a unique opportunity to break through in a big way. They did not with their first album. Their first album made it to the bottom reaches of the Billboard 200. But their second album, Song for America, while not a huge seller, it didn't go gold until the latter part of the 70s, definitely made listeners stand up to attention. The title tune on Song for America is a prog rock powerhouse. It remained a fixture in Kansas's live sets for many years, and the success of the album helped Kansas to achieve regular success on the charts for many years going forward. Their third album, Mask, was a moderate success, but their fourth and fifth albums, Left Overture and Point of No Return, were mega hits, with Carry On Wayward Son from Left Overture and Point of No Return, and especially Dust in the Wind from the Point of No Return album, remaining classic rock radio staples again to this day. Last but not least of the North American bands is Rush. Rush started not as a prog band, but as a hard rock band in 1974, and really at their outset only had significant regional success in their native Toronto and a little bit later in Cleveland, thanks to the friendly disc jockey Donna Halper. Most Rush fans know the story of what happened after that. Their second and third albums, now featuring their new drummer and lyricist Neil Peart, Fly By Night and Caress of Steel, did not do well, but remain fan favorites. Rush's record company, Mercury Records, were not happy with the underperformance of these records. It ultimately required Rush and their manager, Ray Daniels, to plead with Mercury to allow them one last shot. Mercury said, yes, but this one's got to be commercial. You have to put everything into making this one a commercial success. And Rush basically said no. Alex, Geddy, and Neil basically said, if we're going to go down in flames, it'll be our way, doing it the way we want. And they created the classic 2112, released in March of 1976. 2112 is a mini rock opera in 21 minutes, with even an overture truly constructed in the way an overture would be in an opera, containing bits and snatches from all the different songs that were part of the presentation. Rush, of course, would continue with a progressive rock bent to their work throughout the 70s and into the early 80s. Arena rock would stay a fixture of American rock radio until the early 1980s, when the MTV Music Television Network became readily available through cable TV in most people's homes, and music took a different direction. But arena rock persists on radio, of course, to this day. And it could be argued that arena rock helped the established progressive rock bands to get reestablished when they returned to the marketplace. Emerson, Lake and Palmer, of course, would return to the marketplace in 1977 with their albums Works Volume 1 and Volume 2. Pink Floyd, as I mentioned, would return with Wish You Were Here, Animals, and their 1979 mega hit, The Wall. King Crimson did not return immediately. They would not regroup under a new banner until 1981. But Robert Fripp would return to recording in 1976 and would work with multiple acts to give something of a prog flavor to their music. It could be argued that David Bowie's Berlin trilogy in particular wouldn't have happened the same way without the support of Brian Eno and Robert Fripp in particular. And then there were other bands that emerged as well. While Atlantic had Genesis under contract going back to 1973, they did not really break out as a hit band in the United States until their tour in 1974 for The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. At the end of this tour, of course, it was announced that Peter Gabriel was leaving Genesis. Phil Collins, of course, would take over vocal duties for the band, and interestingly, and in some people's eyes, ironically, Genesis would have their greatest successes under Phil Collins' vocal leadership, starting with their February 1976 album, A Trick of the Tail, which charted better than any of the Gabriel-era Genesis albums did in their first release. Peter Gabriel, of course, would have a significant career in his own right. So, two different strains of prog rock. One, something of the classic original strain from the late 60s into the early 70s, and the arena rock strain, which, yeah, I know some people argue that it's not true progressive rock, but again, I'm not entirely sure that progressive rock would have lasted as long for us to enjoy as a genre if the arena-type bands didn't emerge and have significant success on rock radio and in the marketplace itself. Anyway, that's all for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it, as always. Feel free to leave your comments. I will do my best to respond whenever I can. If you liked the episode, of course, please click like. If you haven't subscribed to Progpaganda yet, of course, please do that as well. Thank you again, and we will be back soon. Take good care. Bye-bye.